Hi, and welcome to Reporting on Education, the Monitor's spiritual approach. It's being hosted by the Christian Science Monitor, of course, and I'm Amelia Newcomb. I'm the Monitor's managing editor. I'd like to kick things off by thanking you all so much for taking the time to join us today. Education is a big topic at the moment, as we all know, and it's getting a lot of attention, but really it's always been deeply important to the Monitor. And after all, it's fundamental to what we value as Christian Scientists: a commitment to progress, to gaining new insights, to breaking down barriers and perceived boundaries and limitations and inequities, and of course, to ongoing study. So today, we'll explore together how our writers and editors work to fulfill the Monitor's purpose. As its founder, Mary Baker Eddy, outlined in the first edition of the Monitor in 1908, to spread undivided the science that operates unspent. So I'll introduce you to our panelists in a couple of minutes, but first, let me introduce Dave Scott. He's the Monitor's audience engagement editor, and he'll tell us a little bit about how today's webinar will go.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the comments that you've sent in. Your prayers and your inspiration have been wonderful. We really appreciate it. We would love to have you participate in sending in your questions for our panelists during this event. To submit a question, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type in your questions. I'll be monitoring your questions and comments while the panelists are talking, and I'll be back later in the program to share your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And just to underscore, we would really love to hear your questions, so I hope you'll contact Dave. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists, one of whom is an editor and one of whom is a writer. And they will share how they apply their prayer and their understanding of Christian Science to their work. So first is Senior Monitor Editor Trudy Palmer. Hi, Trudy. Who has extensive experience in higher education. She was an assistant dean at Washington University in St. Louis, an assistant professor of English at Tufts University in Massachusetts, and an assistant professor of English and Black Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. She is also a former editor of the Christian Science magazines, and she is wrapping up her work as editorial director for the marketing department at Principia. She got her BA in English from UCLA and her PhD in English from Stanford University. And we also have with us today Chelsea Sheasley. Hi, Chelsea, who is a freelance education reporter for the Monitor. Chelsea has covered education extensively for us, both from the East Coast and also the Pacific Northwest. She's worked as a writer for the Tacoma, Washington public school system. And prior to that, in a previous iteration at the Monitor, she was our Asia editor, and she was responsible for all copy coming from that region. And Chelsea holds a BA in history from Principia College and a master's in journalism from Boston University. So welcome to you both again. And I'll just say at this point, the first part of our program will be a panel discussion with both Trudy and Chelsea, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So I'd like to start off by asking you, Trudy, as we've just noted through running through what you've done in your professional life, you spent a lot of time on university campuses. And one of the stories we shared with readers was about small colleges and how they're navigating the pandemic. And how do you see that story as fulfilling the Monitor's mission?
Thanks, Amelia. I'd love to talk about that. First, though, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's on this Zoom. Thank you for praying about education. And I hope you find the Monitor a good partner in your prayers. So it's not news that small colleges have for a while now been facing struggles. There's a declining demographic of college-bound students. There's liberal arts are sort of falling out of favor. There's the rising cost. There's interest in career-bound majors. All of those thought forces have caused small colleges to struggle, sometimes close. And then you add the pandemic, and it seems like it would be a recipe for disaster. But what our Monitor writer found in the article that Amelia mentioned is not so. What she found is that the model of thought so central to small colleges, that emphasis on community, turns out to be a pandemic safeguard. As she demonstrated, the community, and driven at Colby College by the students, who you might remember, they had this wristband that would remind them that their individual actions affected the community, and it worked. Cases were very low at the time the article was written. I checked last night, they're still very low. That model of thought that is so prized and demonstrated, we're seeing, by small colleges is making a big difference. Now, the fact that the writer ferreted that out and brought it to the surface, it's not at all like putting on rose-colored glasses. There's plenty in the article to indicate small colleges aren't out of the woods yet. But what, for me, the article did was to dispel the sort of pure gloom and doom view, not only of small colleges, but of the pandemic. I so appreciate that identifying that model of thought sheds light and brings hope.
Yeah, the model of thought is so important. It really is such a foundational thing. And one of the things we really think about a lot at the Monitor is, yeah, as Trudy put it, ferreting it out, understanding it, probing a little more deeply to see what may be going on that might not be recognizable right away, or that, you know, maybe more traditional reporting might not value quite as much. So Chelsea, you know, as Trudy pointed out, schools are facing so many major new challenges at the moment. And you wrote a story recently about homeschooling and that version of a response to the pandemic. And I'm just wondering, especially amid the current challenges, how did you go about reporting that?
Yeah, thank you, Amelia. And I'd just like to echo Trudy's comment. So glad to be here today and so glad for everyone participating. That homeschool story that you mentioned was one that I worked on over the summer when my editors and I were just seeing these early polls indicating that the number of students who are going to be homeschooled in the United States, which typically stands at about 3%, was just going to skyrocket this year because of the pandemic. And we wanted to explore what impact that was going to have and how are families going to approach this when they haven't had any experience necessarily homeschooling before. So as I was working on this story, I was definitely praying, because I think a lot of times there's a perception that homeschooling only occurs for a small number of maybe wealthy, white, stay-at-home parents. And what I was seeing in the data was that that wasn't quite the case in this situation. There really was a lot of interest in homeschooling from across a range of races and classes. So I needed to reflect that in the piece. So many times when I'm praying to find sources for an article, I often like to pray with a line from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy that reads, "Love inspires, illumines, designates, and leads the way." And for this specific story, that first inspiration I got was to go research online and look on social media and look for groups that had been formed just for homeschool students. So through that, I was able to contact some of the founders of those groups and set up some interviews. And I ended up having some really useful conversations, including one woman, Marla from California, who had established a homeschool cooperative for Latino and Indigenous families. And they had found a way to really celebrate their cultural heritage and to balance doing their own work and homeschooling by supporting each other with childcare. So I thought that was a really nice narrative to include in the Monitor of something that was showing that maybe it was possible for homeschooling not just to be the privilege of a few, but it could be expanded out a little more. I was glad to be able to include that.
And it's great that you found those people. And, conversation is obviously, we spend a lot of time as journalists, as reporters, talking to our subjects. So how do you guide that conversation? How do you elicit the information that really will strengthen the story and that actually shows that you're really listening to your subject and not imposing your own ideas, but that you're letting them express themselves and their thinking be expressed robustly? How do you go about that?
Well, I think one of the most important jobs for a journalist and a journalist writing for the Christian Science Monitor is to really be listening for discernment, to kind of be able to ask those best questions or follow up to because the goal is through the conversation you want to be bringing to the surface and what are the leading reasons why there are these big problems, or where can I see credible evidence of peace or goodness or some of these qualities that are really laws of God in operation. So in order to discern that, it really is praying and listening to God's direction. I like to pray a lot with this verse from Hebrews in the Bible, and it reads in part, "The word of God is quick and powerful and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart." And, before I have an interview, of course, I'll prepare questions and I'll have a list of questions. But I always pause and take a moment just to affirm that I'm receptive to the right questions. And a new question might come up or a good follow up, but I can listen, really listen, and hear what's the right thing to ask or to follow up on.
That's great. And it's I think it helps the subject of the story also really feel respected and empowered and, relaxed and willing to chat with you because of that openness that you're creating in terms of listening and a prayer-based openness that can make such a difference. Per your homeschooling story, I think you do a great job of giving people some hope and a sense of the path forward. But I know there are also elements in any story that sometimes can be more difficult. And it's focusing on what we all need to pray about or what we need to be alert to. And Trudy, actually, you've spoken powerfully in some of our conversations about reporting that sometimes can leave you feeling a little bit heartbroken. And one example you gave was from Chelsea's story, and thought maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. Chelsea, I thought you did a phenomenal job of reporting in that story. I was so impressed, as you've just explained, at the range of people, backgrounds, income levels that you found, and at the variety of reasons and benefits that people were finding in homeschooling. So thank you. But I have to admit that, of course, you can't find what's not there. And it seemed to me that what was missing is a pretty big group of people who are low-income wage earners punching a clock, who have zero flexibility in their work schedule. And I'm just thinking, how is this ever going to be accessible to them? And that's the heartbreak. But I don't stay there. I move on. And here I'm not really functioning as an editor, obviously. I'm reading the story in the paper. I'm functioning as a reader. And I'm thinking, that can't be right. God doesn't play favorites. And the line also from Science and Health that immediately came to me is, love is impartial and universal in its adaptation and bestowals. So nobody is left out of that. And there's the right answer for each family. And I don't know what that answer is, but I am sticking to the fact that no one is excluded from the omnipotence of love's impartial, universal bestowals.
The way you put that makes me think of the unity really between editors and writers and readers, that we're all engaged in that process of thinking, okay, where do I need to address my prayers? And if I'm struggling with something in a story, what can I do to uplift that situation? And it's just great to know that we're all unified in that outlook as we approach a story. One thing I thought I'd share with you listeners is how at the Monitor as a team, we try to make sure that we are addressing what needs to be addressed in a story. And we have a little system that we use, and we call it UMP or UMP. It sounds a little silly, but I'll explain it. And every week, a group of editors, a small group of editors, basically grades all the stories that we share in the daily, and we gauge them according to certain criteria, and then see where we can do better and maybe what we've done well, that kind of thing. So to explain the initials, U is for understanding others. And we ask ourselves, are we showing our common humanity at work? So even in the darkest places or most difficult situations, are we looking for courage? Are we looking for forgiveness? Are we looking for resilience and finding it? And are we scoping out as well the hope and the unity that often gets overlooked, especially in zones where things seem very perilous, like a conflict zone or something? So that's understanding. The M is for models of thought, which we've already talked about a little bit. So in that case, we ask ourselves, is there a different or deeper way of looking at this story? And what are the motives or worldviews at work in this situation? How do the subjects of the story, how did they come to see things this way? And we also ask, what's the counter narrative? And where is the overlooked nuance that's missing from the public conversation, but maybe actually really important to understanding the situation better? And then finally, there's P, which is for progress. And that is, looking for hope or a way forward. Is it there? Usually it is. Sometimes it takes a little digging, but we've had so many situations where reporters have pressed a little bit, and you can see in the respondents' thought, well, yeah, actually, there are some people doing something about this, or, and it shifts their thought and they share a little bit more. Or if the progress really isn't that apparent, then, what constructive insights can we take from this moving forward? So that just shares a little bit about UNP, but I know, Chelsea, you talk about that in relation to your reporting. So I wondered if you could share a story where you've thought about those standards.
Yeah, well, I was actually just working on a piece where I was thinking about that. I just finished a story that hasn't been published yet, but it'll come out soon, on cybersecurity attacks on K-12 school districts. And this is something that has really increased in part due to the reliance on remote learning right now. Schools are seeing a lot of cybersecurity attacks, but it's also been a growing trend over the past couple of years. So as I was talking with an editor at the Monitor about this, she was really asking me, as I explored this topic and identified why and how it was happening, she really asked me to also be looking at, where are the points of progress on this and possible solutions? What are school leaders doing to respond to this threat? And what are the steps of progress that they're taking? So I was finding that superintendents and school boards this was becoming a bigger priority for them. They were taking it more seriously, and they were investing in some steps like better cybersecurity defenses and insurance, and also training, and really training their staff and their students on cyber hygiene, best practices with passwords, etc. So I loved that the editor asked me to pinpoint progress, and to a degree too, we are also looking at models of thought and how were the superintendents and other school leaders shifting their thought on this topic.
That's great. That's the writer's perspective. Of course, Trudy, you offer the editor's perspective on this. And so how does UMP, how do they influence your thinking about a story?
Well, I completely agree with Chelsea that I think the editor is most useful when he or she can start at the beginning, before the reporting even begins, to work with the writer to find the UMP, or at least to be on the lookout for it. Obviously, the writer can't change the events that are happening. You have to report accurately about what's going on. But I see my role at that early stage is to help figure out, so where should you look for the humanity? Where might we find that? Where is the transformation in thought that is happening within individuals, and a transformation of thought that they're willing to see in others? And then also, again, urging, as Chelsea just illustrated, the editor saying, so where's the progress? And so I guess I see my role as the editor in that early stage. Since I'm not sort of in the thick, on the front lines of the reporting, it's maybe a little easier for me to hang on to those three things and just keep encouraging and helping to figure out where we can find those, because I'm not quite as submerged in the details of the events. But I would also just add that the Monitor tackles tough things, obviously, and it should. Our mission isn't to write happy stories. It's to spread undivided the science that operates unspent. And science is operating unspent, including in places where conflict and confusion seem to, have the run of things. That's where the Monitor really needs to be. And that's where, along with, of course, reporting the events, the Monitor is then going to move beyond that to whether it's uncover the error, the modes of thinking that are contributing to the problem, whether it's finding the light, whether it's revealing the individual's humanity, their willingness to see others' humanity, and the paths forward. So I love it that the Monitor is right where it belongs, in the thick of things, but bringing to it this uplifting and frankly confident determination that God's laws are in operation and they're not hidden from us. We can see them and we can share them.
I love your point about confidence, because I think, confidence is doing something with faith and with understanding, and that I've seen over and over again, both as an editor and in past writing that I've done, cases where even the subjects have said, thank you for asking the kinds of questions, as I mentioned before. And or when they see the article, once it's written, a real gratitude for not just seeing one piece of the life around them. Because, I used to say when we were, I was international news editor and we were covering wars and things like that. There are a lot of very difficult stories there, but daily life went on and people persevered and they were showing resilience. And it was buoying for them to see that part of their lives recognized as well. And not in some way that ignored what they were dealing with, but that also recognized that power of their persistence and their spirit. So thanks for that mention of confidence. Now we thought we'd move to the questions that Dave Scott mentioned earlier in our conversation. And I think, Dave, there he is. It looks like you've got a few to ask.
Yes, I have several questions already. And thanks everybody for sending those in. If you'd like to send your question or comment again, just again, look at the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, and we'll get to as many as we can. Here's the first one. We've gotten several about homeschooling, and one in particular, or a couple here, focused on the longevity of homeschooling. Are we sort of entering a new era of homeschooling? And for also a similar question related to that, or a follow-on to that from the Redmond Church, with the rise in homeschooling, have you seen an increase in the original thinking that parents are the primary educators in each child's life?
You know, as I was reporting this story, I was asking some of the sources about the longevity of homeschooling and what kind of impact it might have. And Susan Wise Bauer is someone who's written a lot about homeschooling. And her take on this was that she expected a sizable bump right now because of parents having a range of motives, either being health concerns, but also just wanting to experiment with having a bigger role in their child's class, or studying topics like African history that aren't necessarily as commonly taught in the schools. But Susan Wise Bauer's perception was that probably after this huge spike, it might level off and a lot of kids might go back to their schools, but some parents and families and students might discover that it works better for them, and that trend that has been steadily ticking up over time will increase. And the second part of the question about the parents and that primary role is really interesting. And I think a lot of the people I talked with in the story who were homeschooling were grappling with that question of what's their role, what's the school's role. Some people really enjoyed having more time with their kids to explore that. And even some people who plan to go back to public schools felt like they'd be more confident with talking with their teachers or taking a little bit of a greater role than they had in the past because they now have had that experience under their belts.
And, you know, I would just add that I think that last piece that you were talking about, Chelsea, in particular, is not just a kind of bonus, perhaps, of a bump in homeschooling, but I have certainly heard that, you know, all of those families who were suddenly doing remote school as schools shut down, and many still are, that as difficult as it is, with many of them also juggling jobs, that they have loved knowing more about their child's education and being in the classroom, so to speak, with their child a little bit more. And I'm confident, you know, as you said, as students will go back to school and that kind of thing, but having tasted the value and the beauty and the richness of that, I don't think parents are going to give it up. You know, they'll embrace it in whatever the next iteration of school is. They'll be more involved and more engaged.
We have a number of questions here about the growing, what's perceived as a growing divide between the haves and have-nots, whether it's a flight to, there was one question about a flight to private school, where in-person schooling continues more often than in public schools. And just maybe if you could talk a little bit about how is the monitor, or how are you prayerfully thinking? I know, Trudy, you've already talked a little bit about this, but how are you thinking about this sense that there's a growing divide between the haves and the have-nots, whether it's in public schools or online learning?
Trudy, do you want to start in on that one?
Well, I wouldn't say that I have reached perfect peace about it. It's something that I have to continue to grapple with, because there does seem to be a lot of evidence of that. But I don't know what the answer is for each family, but Jesus fed the multitudes, and I just am not going to, what cannot God do? Mrs. Eddy says, I'm not going to limit or contribute to the sort of prevailing thought of limitation by deciding, oh, we've lost a generation. I'm just not going to do that. And sometimes, often in my experience, I've found that as I persist in sticking with the truth, there becomes a hands-on way that I can make a difference. Now, that hasn't evolved yet, but I'm open to it. And I'll let you know if it does.
Chelsea, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. And I think just one thing that comes to thought is I had an experience a couple years ago when I was working in Tacoma Public Schools, which is when I first really started to become aware of equity issues and just these big divides. And I remember I was reading the Bible lesson one week and equity was right there in the Bible. It's many times I went back to look up, and I think the one I had read about was in Psalms, where it was talking about God like establishing equity and ruling with righteousness. And that was just so enlightening to me, because I kind of associated the term with this modern concept and divides now, but realizing that the Bible addresses this and says that God establishes equity, that's just been a big rock for me to lean on as I'm reporting on equity issues. And like Trudy said, trying to not get discouraged that there are going to be these huge divides forever, not to limit people, but no, there can be an individual way to find what each person really needs, whether it's through mentors or after school programs. There's a lot of ways that people are trying to reach out to those who might not have as many resources traditionally for them.
No, I would just add one little thing to that, and I will apologize. As we started, somebody in my neighborhood decided to pick up a chainsaw. So if you're hearing that in the background, I do apologize. But I think sometimes with education, it's so easy to think, oh, every year, every movement is so crucial. And if we miss a step, then, my kid won't get ahead. And it's, the consequences can seem very high. The stakes can seem very high. And yet the thought that comes to mind is, for we be brethren. And having that sense that it is the family of man, and we don't gain at others' expense. We don't have to fall prey to that idea that, well, I've just got to do what's right for my family and do that first, but that there can be that sense of how collectively can we all move together? Can we all see progress? And then, I try to think about, you were both alluding to, where can my prayerful thinking about that lead me to take perhaps a practical step that will help break the mesmerism of that, the stakes are so high, and which can be a little bit fearful and then make us forget our fellow man sometimes.
Can I have a second turn? I was just thinking about, it was in last week's lesson, in the responsive reading, I think, it says, I had to go to my phone to find it. Therefore will the Lord wait, that he may be gracious unto you. And I looked up the word wait, and it means, in Strong's Concordance, it means adhere to. So what it's saying is that therefore will the Lord adhere to you, you're inseparable, that he may be gracious unto you. And so, I think that's sort of what we're all talking about, that no one is separated from God, and God is adhering to us. And, what more, in a way, what more could you ask for? We have to see that in action, but that is the truth, and that is our answer.
We have a question here from someone who said, Trudy used the phrase science operating on spent. Did I hear that correctly? If not, or even so, could this be explained? I'm guessing it's a quote maybe I should know. Amelia, you kind of referenced that at the beginning as well. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit for folks, where it came from. And
yeah, in the Monitor's first edition, 1908, Mrs. Eddy referred to the Monitor's mission as spreading undivided, the science that operates unspent. And I see that as the science that undergirds everything we do, that operates continuously and in an uninterrupted fashion. That's the foundation of us standing on basically a firm foundation of God governing all, of helping us understand his ever presence and his knowledge and, and care and love that governs all mankind, and that we can spread that in an undivided way. I don't know if Trudy or Chelsea, you have any thoughts to add?
Well, it's just to say that it's the science operating unspent is, of course, uppercase S science, and which Mrs. Eddy defines as the laws of God. So those laws of God are operating unspent, and that we are spreading undivided, spreading, not to a privileged few, but we are spreading undivided that science, those divine laws in operation. I don't know if that helps.
That's good, thank you. We have a number of questions that are circling around. Is this a time that we should be rethinking education, given all the challenges that it's facing? And should education help children think more independently and less conformist? I don't know if you guys want to try to tackle something like that, but is this a moment in education that is prompting a rethink? Are you seeing a rethink at all?
That's a great question, and I think so, to a certain degree. One of the stories that was sent out to participants for this webinar was the cover story in early September about that topic of what are some of the inequalities that are happening, and what are the opportunities right now for rethinking things. And because schools are put in a situation where they're doing things they have not done before, they are experimenting, even small things like trying to take classes outside or involving more parents. When you read education articles and talk to people, a lot of people are saying, this is the biggest disruption to public education ever, or in 100 years. And that doesn't come about very often. And I think educators are so dedicated to their students and to that learning that Amelia talked about, of really broadening thought and caring about the future of their students and caring about their potential. And I know there have been teachers and superintendents I've interviewed who said this is kind of an opportunity, and it's giving us some potential to try some new things.
Now, one piece of that too is, and we've seen this over the years, you see efforts to change even the physical relationship between the teacher and the students in terms of how you are present in the classroom. Less a move away from teacher tells you what to think and you reflect that back to the teacher. And one place I think that you're seeing more of this, and the current situation could accelerate that, is in having a variety of groups tell their stories. It's, there's tended to be a very, again, it's not the teacher, it's the publisher, or it's a small group of people telling a variety of stories, which they may or may not be as familiar with. And we did a story recently on this. Trudy, you said it's a story that you've liked quite a bit. I wonder if you wanted to share about it.
Yeah, I did. I really liked it. It was called A Canadian First Nation Reclaims the Telling of Its Own Story. It was in the September 1st issue. And I loved it. I loved both the content, what it was explaining, and I loved the way in which it was reported. And in short, it is about a group of Indigenous people in Canada who are, as the title says, reclaiming their story. They are publishing their traditions and their beliefs and their practices. And so that people aren't relying on sort of the Hollywood view of Indigenous people. They are hearing it straight from those who know and are living this. And I loved, first of all, that it shows that you're not stuck, communities aren't stuck in stereotypes. They have agency. These publications are, millions are reading them. They're in libraries, they're in schools. It's not a small thing. And the power of that, essentially sharing the truth about their experience, is enormous. And it was beautifully demonstrated in the way it was written. The reporter and family and her family, including her little girl, went out with this indigenous family, learning about these traditions, went out on this boat. And you could kind of see the reporter shared the transformation in the daughter's thought from a sort of stereotyped view from movies to what she had learned. And by the end of the article, you sort of felt like, oh, that child's view is transformed and so is mine. I got to go along in that boat with them and my view is transformed. It was, I thought, really very well done. And it's so important to hear that variety of voices, that the monitor is prizing that and giving it that space is fabulous.
I have a question here, a follow-up question about this phrase model of thought. They're asking you to unpack that a little bit and maybe help them. How do you as a reporter discern or identify a model of thought, and how does the reader see that too? As a reporter or an editor?
Well, I think that question hits upon why the job can be really difficult sometimes, because it can seem like there's a lot of information coming at you and a lot of different opinions. And that's why I prayed with the passage in the Bible about the simplicity of the Christ. So when I'm thinking about models of thought, and I can't wait to hear what Amelia and Trudy have to say, I'm trying to think about what are the key themes, what's really driving this, for leaders in the field who are having an influence. What is their perception? Many newspapers can just report the facts of who, what, when, where, why, but like, what's behind the decisions they're making? What are the perceptions that they're carrying that are undergirding this? Because if we're approaching this as people who want to pray about it, we need to know, what are people thinking about? What are their guiding principles on this? So I think that's why writing for the Monitor can be much more challenging than writing for your daily paper, because we're trying to look at a deeper level. And to bring that out practically, it kind of means like, start with the basic easy questions, establish a rapport. You do need to know who, what, when, where, and why, but then once you're comfortable with someone asking, and why do you think that? Like, how are you thinking about your students, or what gives you hope, or what do you think is holding them back the most?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that a lot of times there are assumptions that underlie how we think. And we might not even be aware of those assumptions, but I think that sometimes, now I'm not a reporter, I'm not doing that hard work out in the field that Chelsea is, but I would guess that trying to understand, so what makes you think that, or getting to the sort of fundamental assumptions about how people are seeing their own situation, how people are seeing others, and that can illuminate how we got where we are in this problem, or it might illuminate a path forward. But so I guess I would say part of what's behind models of thought is uncovering the framework, the infrastructure under those. And a lot of times those are assumptions that, maybe even the people you're interviewing haven't fully articulated to themselves.
That's great. And I have a model of thought question, a follow-up question here. The framework, they're challenging a mental framework here, because the question is, because education is often correlated with competition, individuals competing for educational opportunities, individuals competing for a work or job. And I'm shorthanding this, but do you have any inspirations that you could relate to a more elevated view of education, something more profound than fueling or thwarting competition? Yeah.
I mean, to me, it goes back to a little bit about what I said in the introduction, that it's what we value as Christian Scientists. It's education is really ultimately about breaking down barriers. You know, I often think of universities, you know, the word universe, it's a universe of people working for breakthroughs, working to see things in a new way at their best. I mean, we all know it's complicated, but you know, that education really is about refusing to accept that where we are is where we have to stay. And I think it is challenging to, you know, think about the competition and you've got to do this, you've got to do that to get ahead and so forth. But I think if we can genuinely base our thinking in opportunity for all, for a sense of unlimited opportunity, for a sense of unlimited thought and unrestrained openness to progress, that's ultimately what education is about, because it's fundamentally that each person can make progress and grow, and education is about growth. It's not about just the accumulation of facts. It's how you learn to shape the world. So, you know, how that then is reflected in people's individual lives, we have to think about. But I find it helpful to think about education as just opening the door ever wider and wider. And when we don't see that, how can we help that door and that sense of openness expand?
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say that one of the readers shared with us ahead of time how they're involved in education, and they were praying with Mrs. Eddy's quote about academics of the right sort are requisite, and they really expand thought. And I worked on a story earlier this spring, where I went to Worcester in Massachusetts, and I ended up finding a father who had a young son, and he, you know, there were a lot of challenges with remote learning, but he told me he was interested in summer school because he saw the real potential and personality of his son now. And I think when you're asking about that competition, you know, didn't this father kind of find a deeper motive for why he wanted his son to be educated? It wasn't really about competition or finding the best job. It was that he saw his son's real potential and real personality, and he knew that that son could thrive and that education would help him with that.
You know, I love that. And I think also beyond, sort of outside of the pandemic, before the pandemic, I think that there are huge shifts in education because of technology. And, you know, like you said, it's not anymore, okay, I'm feeding you this knowledge and you're spitting it back. Well, there would be a chance for someone to spit it back better than somebody else spit it back. But that's less, I think, I hope. This will be a long-term change, but hopefully that's less of what's happening in the schoolroom, because information is just at our fingertips, and more of what's happening is in fact collaboration. And I think that's one of the abilities, and collaboration and critical thinking, those are, I think, the future skills, much more so than a discrete body of knowledge in many cases. I'm not saying you don't need to know anything, but I do think that those that ability to analyze, that ability to work together, that ability to communicate, those are all much more group abilities than a sort of one-person competition. So I do think that there are shifts happening in how we will define knowledge and education and learning and being well prepared. So for what that's worth.
That's great. Very helpful. Here's one from Kent McKay. It says, with 5 granddaughters in college now, how do I overcome the feeling that the quality of their academics is being compromised by few in-person classes and having to socialize with mass? Maybe you could talk a little bit about addressing the fears of grandparents or parents in this environment.
Well, I'm a parent of 2 young preschoolers, and I know there's been a lot of changes to their preschool and how things operate. And I can empathize with grandparents or relatives of any age who are navigating through all the changes and complexities. And I certainly don't have an answer for you, but I'm grateful that you're thinking about that. And as I've thought about it with my family, that quality, not being stuck in thinking good only has to come in one way. Like I'm going to get good because I go to school and have time with my teachers. I've been thinking about the good that my daughters receive from so many different avenues that maybe I haven't even thought of before. Like they've started to play more with their neighborhood friends, which they never did before because we were so busy and everyone was in set schedules. So just being receptive to, okay, with this change, how is good going to come into my experience? And how can I be surprised that maybe it'll come in a way that I haven't been expecting?
Yeah, I've seen stories about, for example, college kids who can't go to campus. And so instead of just like either living at home or living on campus, but staying in your room, which can seem a little counterintuitive, groups of students going to a locale together, and then they organize themselves and they learn that they support each other and they do things like that. That's what you're talking about, Chelsea, tapping new skills and tapping new ways of doing things, and learning broadly, and that can lead to very rigorous ways of exploring new subjects and so forth. It's unfamiliar, so I think sometimes it can be tempting to believe that, wow, they're not going to get what they need. And there's no question that things are being changed at the moment, and there probably are holes, there definitely are holes that need to be filled and so forth. But I think you just have to really see that people can rise to the occasion and they can find ways to support each other and to provide kinds of learning that will help individuals grow, even if it's an unconventional path based on what we are more familiar with. And Trudy, do you have?
Well, I don't, my daughter is 28, so I'm beyond school age parent, but I do think that the moment is demanding of all of us considerable character growth and including of students. I think they are having to be adaptable and flexible, and those aren't bad things. This might not be the way we would wish for them to learn those, but I think there are ways in which we are all having to grow in character, and that is a plus of the current time, and I think it counts. That character growth counts, as do the academic subjects. So I wouldn't shortchange them, I said.
As you were talking, I'll just add one quick little thing. My parents were people who went through the Depression. My stepfather in particular, his life was enormously disrupted by that. His schooling was unconventional at best. And yet he, even without benefit of the internet, learned so much, adapted in so many ways. And I think, again, as Trudy was saying, that character that drives you forward is very powerful.
Wow, great answers. We don't really have time. We have a ton of questions left on the table here. Over 80 questions were sent in and comments. So thank everybody for that. Let me just toss one more out here that some folks have been asking, Trudy, you mentioned about Canada, story in Canada. The Monitor is often known for its global coverage. Is the Monitor covering this story internationally as well? And are we learning lessons from what other countries are doing in terms of education and how they're handling this situation?
Well, maybe I can take that one because I have been the international editor for many years until fairly recently, and Dave also was international editor. So yes, the short answer is we've always been interested in education internationally, and now is no different. We do have reporters around the world, in Europe and various places, trying to look at the challenges schools are facing in terms of educating kids, and learning from each other, by seeing what France is doing, or what's happening in other countries. Americans can learn things as well, and so that's very important that we share lessons from around the world. And I will say one thing we've covered quite a bit is it's not directly the same thing, but education in conflict zones, where people really have to draw on their ingenuity and their perseverance. And it's just been amazing to see what kids do and what opportunities they seize even under duress. And so again, those are things we can learn from as well. So we will continue to keep an eye on the education story internationally.
Okay.
All right. Well, I guess the time goes by so quickly. It's amazing. But thank you all for all those great questions, and hopefully we'll have time to answer more of them. And you've given us food for thought about ways we can shape our coverage. And, I was just thinking that in the end, what we're all focused on so much is what Mary Baker Eddy lays out as the doctrine of Christian Science, which is that divine love cannot be deprived of its manifestation or object, that joy cannot be turned into sorrow, for sorrow is not the master of joy, that good can never produce evil, and that matter can never produce mind, nor life result in death. That's from Science and Health on page 304. And I love that because it goes to what are you looking at in any given situation? And divine love cannot be deprived of its manifestation. And I would say that's a thing that really drives us at the Monitor, and as we see it always in operation. And Trudy, I know you have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I love that line. It's been very meaningful to me over the years. But I see it in, we talked about the article that had the 5 approaches to improving education. And one of them was joy-based learning. And the expert interviewed talked about a school, primarily white, wealthy families, that children learned through play. Joy was prized. 2 blocks away in a school serving largely low-income families of color, they're walking through metal detectors, and there's strict obedience is enforced. It's like joy is not even on the radar screen. And the Monitor did a good job of acknowledging the inequity. There's plenty to pray about there. But what I loved about it was that joy, the Monitor had surfaced joy, the spiritual nature of man, as an way of improving, as a way acknowledging that as a part of improving education. It reminded me of another of my favorite sentences. I'm going to read to make sure I say it right. It's in Science and Health on page 76. The sinless joy, the perfect harmony and immortality of life, possessing unlimited divine beauty and goodness without a single bodily pleasure or pain, constitutes the only veritable, indestructible man whose being is spiritual. So the simple sentence there obviously is joy constitutes man. And that's true as for the children in both of those schools. And I just thought about, wow, what a gift to surface that truth about our identity, about children's identity, and to encourage teachers, easier said than done, but teach to joy. Don't teach to disobedience or ignorance or apathy. Teach to joy, to eagerness, to receptivity, to love. And again, easier said than done, but But what a goal, and imagine the improvement that would bring to education if we were teaching to that innate aspect of man's identity, to joy.
Well, Trudy and Amelia, this has been so inspiring and such a profound conversation. And I think I'd just like to end my portion by reading a passage where Mrs. Eddy talks about a monitor, and she doesn't use that word very often, but here's one from Miscellaneous Writings. She says, "The spiritual monitor understood is coincidence of the divine with the human, the acme of Christian science. Pure humanity, friendship, home, the interchange of love bring to earth a foretaste of heaven."
Nice.
Well, thank you. That's a really wonderful way to close out this discussion. So thank you both so much for talking about your work today. It's really been interesting. And thank you so much to all of you who've joined us and stayed with us this hour to talk more about education. I should say that we always feel really buoyed by your readership. It matters deeply to us. And it really supports us in what we do. And we love the idea of a conversation and interaction. So we always welcome your comments, even the, excuse me, even the critical ones. So please always feel free to reach out to us if you are so moved. A couple of housekeeping things. If you aren't currently a Monitor subscriber, we'd love to have you join us for free for 1 month. So you'll see a link in the chat to a page where you can sign up if you want to. And another thing, we'll be sending you an email with a survey about today's webinar. These events are recurring, and so we really welcome your feedback so we can make each one better than the last and keep you coming back. And I want to thank a few other people, obviously Trudy and Chelsea again for giving us your insights, and Dave Scott for fielding questions and comments from you, the audience. We'd also like to thank our events team, which is led by Promotions and Events Manager Lauren Crandall, producer Greg Fitzgerald, along with Lena Carlson and Cortland Reekston. And the Monitor's product owner is Kim Proctor. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great afternoon. Bye.